Can you explain clearly, precisely, what is the difference between Catholics and Protestants, saying that we are saved by faith? Okay, so one note. So Protestants would say we're justified by faith, which is slightly different. But that note aside, because I know that I'll hear complaining about it later if I don't distinguish that. But basically, there are, I guess you could say, three different ways, and I'll try to keep this clear, precise. But there's three different ways in which Catholics and Protestants differ on that statement. So the first way is the way in which we define faith qua faith. The second way is what we mean by alone, and the third way is what we mean by justify. So in the first way of what we mean by faith, so Protestants will distinguish between what's called historical faith and fiduciary faith. So historical faith is the knowledge of certain premises, I guess you could say, the assent of mind to certain premises. So the fact that God is Trinity, that's what they would call historical faith. And Catholics, on the other hand, and they'll distinguish that from fiduciary faith, which fiduciary faith, fiducia technically in Latin just means faith, but fiduciary faith, they mean some sort of trust. So you trust in somebody. So the difference between believing that God is Trinity and then trusting in God. And actually, the point that the Protestants do get right is that usually in sacred scripture, at least, faith is not taken in the terms of the theological virtue of faith that Catholics will usually speak of in our catechesis, but I'll explain why that doesn't matter in a second. So Catholics, on the other hand, are going to take faith as the virtue which is inhering in the intellect, which raises the mind habitually above the natural level to be able to assent to the fact that God is and rewards those who are just, for the sake of the fact that God has revealed it, and not on the basis of its intrinsic evidence. And then all those things that God has revealed as well kind of concomitantly goes with it as expanding the object of faith. So that's the way in which our theologians and in catechesis we talk about faith. And there's some places in Scripture where faith is spoken of in this sense. But usually in Scripture, faith is kind of taken for the conglomeration of virtues which justify. So like in the book of James, actually, when it talks about not by faith alone, it usually means it in the sense of faith that our theologians usually refer to it in, and our catechists usually refer to it in. So there is scriptural usage of that term. But usually by faith, Scripture, especially St. Paul, means those conglomeration of virtues which make one just. So it means, and this is going to get into the second question of the alone part. What does it mean by faith alone? So by faith alone, Protestants are going to talk about that fiduciary faith that trust alone, which justifies. Where Catholics are going to talk about that intellectual virtue, which is formed or vivified or enlivened by supernatural charity. So the belief on the things of God and the love of God are going to come together to form living faith, which is that which justifies. And the living faith is going to necessarily result in acts, but technically it's the virtue of living faith and not necessarily the act of living faith, which is going to justify. So when Scripture talks about faith, it actually just means faith working by charity, or fides formata, formed faith, or living faith, as it is called in other places. So some have said that this is equivalent to what the Protestants mean by fiduciary faith. I don't really buy it, and I think Protestant authors have adequately distinguished their view from our view, which is the view that sacred Scripture talks about when it speaks of faith. Their view is not the view that sacred Scripture talks about when it talks about faith. And this is really going to come in when we finally, this last part, because I said first faith, which we differ in faith, where they say it's fiduciary faith. We say it's intellectual virtue, at least in our catechists. And then alone, where we rightly identify Scripture as talking in the usual sense of fides formata, formed faith, living faith, where they're going to keep faith as something which is fiduciary, which isn't the sense in which Scripture talks about it. And this is going to become clear through the third portion, which is what we mean by justify. So by justify, Catholics rightly recognize that when Scripture talks about faith making us just, it actually means faith making us just, because justice is really the right rectitude of the soul. It's the right rectitude, means the right ordering of the soul. So faith formed by charity is the right ordering of both our intellectual and volitional faculties, both our intellect and will, in right relation to God. So fides formata, formed faith, or faith working through charity, is justice. That's what it is. It is justice. So when we say that we are just before God, we mean that God has endowed our intellects and wills with faith and charity. That shouldn't be controversial. And this is the right and orderly reading of sacred Scripture, which St. Thomas abundantly demonstrates in his commentary on the epistles of St. Paul, which he calls the full exposition of the teachings of grace. And if you want to see how all the epistles of St. Paul fit together, you can look at the beginning of St. Thomas's Romans commentary, where he goes over this.